On May 26, 1940, inside the White House, President Franklin Roosevelt sat before radio microphones as technicians made final adjustments. The nation beyond those walls remained battered by economic depression, still scarred by years of unemployment that had hollowed out cities and farming communities across the country. What Roosevelt was about to say would rank among the most daring declarations ever made by an American president. The president's voice carried across the airwaves with unmistakable conviction. "We must produce 50,000 aircraft within the next 12 months, he declared. These would be combat planes, machines built to defend democracy itself, against the gathering darkness across the Atlantic. In Berlin, in the Nazi chancellery, German military officials gathered around the transcripts as they arrived. The numbers caught their attention immediately, but their reactions ranged from skepticism to outright laughter. When the translation reached Adolf Hitler, his military advisors offered reassurance. This was nothing but American bluster, they insisted, mere propaganda designed to intimidate. No nation possessed the capacity to manufacture such quantities. The calculation seemed straightforward enough. American factories had produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft the previous year. The infrastructure for such an expansion simply did not exist. The workforce lacked experience with aircraft manufacturing. Factory buildings had been designed for automobiles, not warplanes. Yet Roosevelt had just committed the nation to increasing production by more than 1,600% in a single year. Hitler's high command dismissed the claim entirely. American leadership, they believed, was simply bluffing from weakness, desperately trying to scare Germany with impossible numbers. The nation lacked both the industrial foundation and the national character to become a genuine military power. They had miscalculated fundamentally. What they failed to grasp was that they were about to witness the most astonishing industrial transformation the world had ever seen. The giant Roosevelt referred to was not America's armed forces, though those would become formidable. It was America's factories and the untapped productive power they possessed. The steel mills stretching across Pennsylvania, the shipyards lining the coasts of California and Oregon, the automobile plants crowding the landscape around Detroit, the aircraft facilities being constructed across the nation, these would soon demonstrate manufacturing capability on a scale that shattered every conventional assumption about warfare. Germany had prepared for tank divisions and disciplined infantry battalions. Nothing had prepared them for what would soon pour from American factories. Pearl Harbor changed everything on December 7, 1941. The Japanese attack forced America into total war, but while military commanders scrambled to mount a response, something equally significant was already gathering momentum across the American industrial heartland. The conversion had begun months earlier, gaining speed with each passing week. Automobile assembly lines were being torn apart and rebuilt. Factory floors underwent complete redesign. Workers participated in intensive retraining programs. The largest economic transformation of the modern age was accelerating toward full power. William Knudsen, formerly the president of General Motors, received a call from Roosevelt to lead this massive industrial mobilization effort. In early 1941, Knudsen made a telephone call that would prove pivotal to the entire war effort. He reached out to K.T. Keller, the president of Chrysler Corporation, with a question that seemed almost absurd. Could Chrysler manufacture tanks? Keller's answer was refreshingly honest. "I don't know. I've never seen a tank in my life. But if you provide us with the specifications and blueprints, we'll find a way to build them." Within weeks, work commenced on the Detroit Arsenal tank plant, a massive facility conceived and designed by Albert Kahn, an architect renowned for revolutionary industrial designs. The main structure would sprawl across 130 acres of land. In crucial areas, walls of reinforced concrete 3 feet thick would shield the plant against aerial bombing. The assembly line would fundamentally transform how armored vehicles were produced worldwide, but the most stunning aspect of the Detroit Arsenal was the speed of its construction. Ground was broken during the winter of 1940 and 1941. On April 24, 1941, the first M3 medium tank emerged from the assembly line, its structure still emerging from partially completed factory walls. Workers erupted in celebration as the fully armed and operational tank demonstrated its firepower blasting its weapons and crushing practice obstacles in a spectacle broadcast to the nation. Allied military observers watched in astonishment. British tank manufacturing demanded extensive hand-fitting and individual customization. Every tank was essentially handcrafted. German production, while somewhat more standardized, still depended heavily on time-consuming skilled labor and meticulous assembly. The Detroit Arsenal introduced true mass production to armored vehicle manufacturing. Albert Kahn proceeded to design an astounding 20 million square feet of defense manufacturing facilities in 1941 alone. His innovative factory designs transported automobile assembly line principles directly into military equipment production. Wide-open factory floors enabled continuous production flow. Massive overhead cranes transported parts smoothly between workstations. Sub-assembly lines fed components into the primary assembly line according to precisely choreographed schedules. The outcome was manufacturing speed that traditional military equipment makers found almost impossible to believe. By December 1942, the Detroit Arsenal established a monthly production record that stunned the world. In a single month, 896 M4 Sherman tanks rolled from the assembly line. This single month's output exceeded the total tank production from all German factories combined during the same period. The plant never ceased operation. 3 separate shifts of workers, including countless women entering factory work for the first time in their lives, kept production moving continuously, day and night. In September 1942, President Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt arrived at the plant. They moved through the assembly line, observing as tanks gradually took shape through intricate, perfectly coordinated manufacturing steps. What unfolded before their eyes was industrial choreography on a scale never witnessed before. When the last tank left the Detroit Arsenal at war's end, 20,134 tanks had been produced there. This represented roughly 1/4 of every tank America manufactured throughout the entire war. The Arsenal had transformed from vacant farmland into the world's most efficient armored vehicle factory in just 2 years. The operation moved with remarkable precision. Component parts arrived from suppliers throughout the Midwest, were organized in systematically arranged warehouses, then transported to workstations according to exacting timetables. The assembly line never stopped. At each position, workers performed specialized functions. Welders fused hull sections. Technicians positioned engines and transmission systems. Electricians connected communication equipment. Gunners installed firing systems. When tanks reached the line's end, they rolled under their own power, straight out of the factory and onto railroad flat cars destined for ports and training centers. Tank manufacturing represented only part of Michigan's industrial transformation. The automobile industry across the state was converting to military production at a pace that seemed impossible. In the town of Ypsilanti, Henry Ford's bold vision was becoming reality. The Willow Run bomber plant would emerge as the most audacious aircraft manufacturing operation ever imagined. Charles Sorensen, Ford's vice president for production, had traveled to Consolidated Aircraft's San Diego facilities in early 1941. What he discovered troubled him profoundly. The B-24 Liberator bomber was being assembled using methods that seemed stuck in the distant past. No blueprints existed for the work. There were no precision measurements. Standardized components did not exist. Every aircraft was essentially built by hand. Assembly occurred outdoors beneath the California sun, where heat caused metal to expand and contract unpredictably, making uniformity impossible. Sorensen watched workers improvising, hammering sheet metal into approximate shapes, making unique adjustments on every single airframe. His frustration became evident as he spoke to his hosts. "This is precisely how we constructed automobiles back in 1906, Sorensen said, back in Ford's infancy. That evening, alone in his hotel room at the Coronado in San Diego, Sorensen began sketching on hotel stationery. He imagined a factory extending a full mile long and a quarter mile across. The B-24 would be disassembled into major component sections. Wings, fuselage segments, tail units, and engine assemblies would be manufactured simultaneously on separate sub-assembly lines. These finished components would then flow together onto a central assembly line where complete bombers would come together with the speed and precision of automobile manufacturing. When Edsel Ford reviewed Sorensen's preliminary sketch the following morning, he and his team approved the concept. This sketch became Willow Run's foundation. Skeptics immediately questioned whether such an outrageous ambition could ever succeed. Construction commenced in spring 1941. The federal government invested $200 million toward the project. Ford supplied engineering knowledge and operational expertise. The resulting structure dwarfed anything previously constructed. 3.5 million square feet existed under a single roof. The assembly line stretched a full mile, making a 90-degree turn midway to avoid extending into Wayne County property, where tax rates were considerably higher. The L-shaped facility became the world's largest single interior space at that time. Yet constructing the structure proved simpler than mastering bomber assembly. Ford's manufacturing team discovered that aircraft required tolerances far exceeding those needed for automobiles. An automobile door off by 1/16 of an inch might close awkwardly. Aircraft wings assembled with equivalent tolerances would generate dangerous aerodynamic defects. Throughout 1942, Willow Run produced merely 56 B-24 bombers. Critics attacked the operation mercilessly. The facility had consumed $200 million and employed 20,000 people. Yet it produced fewer bombers monthly than Consolidated San Diego plant had manufactured prior to the war. Newspaper columnists questioned whether mass production techniques could ever work for complex military aircraft. Aviation specialists contended that bomber manufacturing demanded master craftsmen, not assembly line workers. Ford's legendary reputation hung in the balance. The company that had revolutionized automobile manufacturing with the Model T and invented the moving assembly line was failing at its greatest challenge. Yet Ford refused to surrender. Engineers reconstructed jigs and holding devices, workers underwent demanding training programs. Production techniques underwent constant refinement and adjustment. Systems for ensuring quality were established. By summer 1943, everything clicked into place. The 1000th B-24 emerged from Willow Run's assembly line on November 3, 1943. The achievement drew military officials, government representatives, and thousands of celebrating workers. Equally important, manufacturing momentum was building steadily. By early 1944, Willow Run operated at complete capacity. In April 1944, production reached an extraordinary level. 453 bombers emerged in 468 hours. The factory completed one entire bomber every 63 minutes. The pace was relentless and utterly unprecedented. Willow Run's workforce reflected the broader social revolution reshaping American industry. By late 1943, 42,000 workers staffed the plant. Women made up a substantial percentage of the labor force. These women had not worked in factories before the war. They were housewives, educators, office workers, and retail employees who answered America's call for defense workers. They mastered aluminum riveting, electrical system installation, and precision machinery operation. The government launched sweeping campaigns recruiting women into manufacturing. Rosie the Riveter became the iconic symbol of female industrial workers. Yet behind the propaganda imagery, genuine women were learning sophisticated technical abilities and meeting production quotas that military success required. The transformation's magnitude was extraordinary. Unemployment had reached 14% in 1940. By 1944, it had plummeted to 1.2%. The nation achieved complete employment. More profoundly, roughly 6.5 million women entered industrial employment during wartime. These women worked as welders, equipment specialists, crane operators, quality inspectors, and supervisory personnel. They performed labor that had been exclusively male territory before hostilities began. The shift extended beyond gender divisions. African American workers also accessed opportunities that defense industries uniquely provided. The Great Migration quickened as black workers traveled northward from southern agricultural regions toward northern industrial cities and defense jobs. Though prejudice persisted, labor shortages forced open doors previously locked. The statistics reveal a transformation transcending mere weapons production. 24 million Americans relocated during the war years, pursuing defense employment, military service, or positions within expanding war industries. Detroit, Los Angeles, Portland, and Seattle experienced explosive population growth. Housing markets became desperately tight. Government agencies rushed to construct temporary housing accommodating defense workers. Trailer communities, bunkhouses, and factory-built housing units appeared adjacent to manufacturing facilities. American society's fundamental character was being reconstructed through industrial mobilization's demands. At Willow Run, production accelerated throughout 1944 and into 1945. When the final B-24 departed the assembly line in June 1945, the plant had assembled 8,085 bombers. Additionally, Willow Run had produced approximately 1,893 knockdown kits, entirely disassembled bombers packable for overseas shipment and reassembly near battle zones. Knockdown kits resolved a critical logistics challenge. Flying bombers across the Atlantic demanded tremendous fuel quantities and subjected aircraft to weather hazards and mechanical failures. Transporting disassembled bombers aboard cargo vessels, then reconstructing them at forward positions, proved considerably more efficient. Willow Run's economic improvements were equally remarkable. Manufacturing a B-24 cost $238,000 per aircraft in 1942. By 1944, enhanced efficiency and mass manufacturing methods reduced that to $137,000 per aircraft. This 42% cost reduction occurred simultaneously with dramatically increased production volumes and sustained quality. It demonstrated Ford's manufacturing system's extraordinary power when adapted to military equipment. Tragically, Edsel Ford, the project's champion since conception, passed away on May 26, 1943. He was only 49 years old. Stomach cancer, worsened by strain from directing the bomber plant during its problematic early phase, claimed his life merely 6 months before Willow Run achieved full capacity. He never witnessed his vision's complete triumph, yet his direction had been essential to converting the struggling plant into the world's most productive bomber manufacturing facility. While aircraft and tanks commanded public notice, another industrial transformation was simultaneously unfolding at American shipyards. The Liberty Ship program represented mass production applied to shipbuilding with unprecedented ambition. Before the war, American shipyards progressed leisurely. Constructing a cargo vessel customarily demanded over a year. Skilled shipbuilders hand-fitted each component. Riveting required specialized worker crews. Every ship was individually constructed. Germany's Atlantic U-boat offensive transformed the situation completely. British and American merchant vessels were being destroyed faster than traditional shipbuilding could replace them. By 1941, conditions were turning desperate. Britain depended on Atlantic convoys for food, fuel, and military goods. Should submarines prevail in the tonnage conflict, Britain would face starvation regardless of military achievements elsewhere. Henry Kaiser, a construction specialist experienced with dams and highways but entirely new to shipbuilding, proposed an unorthodox approach. Standardize ship designs. Prefabricate components before assembly. Employ welding technology rather than traditional riveting. Apply automobile manufacturing principles to shipbuilding. Traditional shipbuilders responded skeptically. Ships they maintained demanded artisanal skill that could never be mechanized. Kaiser held a different conviction. He believed dividing shipbuilding into standardized operations, instructing workers in focused tasks, and orchestrating prefabricated sections assembly could substantially accelerate manufacturing. The desperate government granted Kaiser the opportunity to demonstrate his revolutionary concept. The Liberty ship emerged from a straightforward British design, the Trump steamer, but engineers stripped it down and reimagined it entirely for rapid production. These vessels stretched 441 feet long, with a 57-foot beam, capable of shouldering 10,000 tons of cargo while maintaining a cruising speed of 11 knots through the waters. Everything about the design reflected pure function, no ornament, no unnecessary complexity, just a practical cargo carrier engineered to be built fast and affordably. Creating each Liberty ship demanded 250,000 individual parts manufactured across factories scattered throughout the country. These components then traveled to shipyards where workers assembled them into major sections. The bow, stern, deck houses, and cargo holds came together through precise welding. Roughly 114 miles of welded seams held each completed vessel as a single unit. That translated to approximately 600,000 feet of welding work per ship. The scale of this welding challenge was truly remarkable. Kaiser opened shipyards in Richmond, California and Portland, Oregon to handle the volume. Competitors established their own Liberty shipyards in Baltimore, Houston, and stretching along both coasts. At the war's peak in 1944, American shipyards were sending 3 Liberty ships down the slipways every single day. The benchmark that grabbed headlines came in November 1942 at Kaiser's Richmond facility. The SS Robert E. Perry launched just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after work officially began on the keel. This astounding achievement relied on meticulous pre-positioning of materials and served as a publicity showcase rather than typical production. The reality was that additional work and fitting out happened after launch, and the ship wasn't truly ready during that time frame. Still, the stunt revealed what focused organization could accomplish. More realistic were the construction timelines achieved by 1943 and 1944. Ships requiring 244 days to complete in early 1941 were being finished in 39 to 42 days by mid-war years. That six-fold acceleration came from constant process refinement, strengthened supplier coordination, and workforce expertise that deepened over time. When the war ended, American shipyards had built 2,610 Liberty ships. 18 different yards across the nation participated in this 5-year program stretching from 1941 through 1945. Despite their plainness and modest capabilities, Liberty ships proved absolutely vital to Allied success. They crossed the Atlantic in sufficient numbers to maintain Britain's lifeline. They transported the vehicles, supplies, ammunition, and fuel sustaining Allied forces across North Africa, Italy, and France. Many Liberty ships kept working long after peace returned. Some vessels remained active into the 1960s and 1970s. Their simple, sturdy construction demonstrated remarkable longevity. What truly mattered was proving that complex products, like ocean-going vessels, could be mass-produced by relatively untrained workers given proper systems and organization. American shipbuilding during wartime stretched far beyond Liberty ships alone. The total output reached 5,077 merchant vessels of all descriptions. This encompassed oil tankers, troop transports, refrigerated cargo ships, and specialized vessels for every conceivable need. Simultaneously, American naval shipyards were building warships at breathtaking rates. Aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and escort vessels flowed from naval yards. American shipyards additionally produced approximately 89,000 landing craft of various types. The most famous were the Higgins boats designed for the beaches of Normandy. Andrew Higgins, a boat builder from New Orleans, had created a shallow draft vessel with a lowering bow ramp originally intended for Louisiana swamps and marshes. Military planners recognized that scaling up this design and adding armor would create the perfect amphibious assault craft. Higgins' company eventually produced over 20,000 landing craft, fundamentally expanding Allied amphibious capabilities. Industrial mobilization extended into sectors that received little public notice but proved equally essential. American factories produced 193,000 artillery pieces during wartime. These ranged from small anti-tank guns to massive howitzers capable of devastating firepower. Tank production reaching 86,000 units represented a tremendous leap from pre-war levels when American tank manufacturing had been practically non-existent. 2 million Army trucks rolled off assembly lines, providing the transportation that enabled American and Allied forces to execute swift operations once they pushed ashore in Europe. The Red Ball Express, the truck convoy network that kept Allied armies moving across France during summer and fall 1944, depended entirely on American-manufactured trucks. The sheer numbers of American war production become clearer when stacked against enemy capabilities. By 1944, American industry was turning out roughly 2/3 of all Allied military equipment. This meant American factories were equipping not just American soldiers, but supplying substantial portions of British, Soviet, French, and other Allied forces. Lend-Lease shipments carried American-produced tanks, aircraft, trucks, and supplies across oceans to partner nations. The Soviet Union, despite producing impressive quantities independently, relied heavily on American trucks, food, and raw materials. Britain's strained industry and vulnerability to bombing made it dependent on American production for many specialized components. Transforming American industry required more than simply constructing new factories. It demanded unprecedented collaboration between government and private business. The War Production Board, established in January 1942, controlled allocation of raw materials, set production priorities, and arbitrated conflicts between competing demands. Steel, aluminum, copper, and rubber were distributed according to military necessity. Civilian manufacturing was drastically cut back or eliminated for numerous product categories. Automobile production for regular consumers stopped completely in February 1942. The final civilian car came off the line and wouldn't return until after victory. Plants that previously built refrigerators, washing machines, and household appliances switched entirely to military production. Rationing extended to ordinary citizens at home. Gasoline, meat, sugar, coffee, and countless other goods faced strict rationing to guarantee military supply adequacy. The career of R.G. Letourneau exemplifies the entrepreneurial spirit that flourished during industrial mobilization. Letourneau was an inventor and manufacturer specializing in earth-moving equipment. Before the conflict, his company had pioneered innovative scrapers, bulldozers, bulldoors, and heavy machinery. During wartime, Letourneau factories supplied roughly 70% of all earth-moving equipment used by Allied forces. His designs included enormous scrapers capable of moving massive volumes of earth quickly, enabling rapid construction of airfields, roads, and defensive structures. Letourneau held approximately 300 patents throughout his lifetime, with 78 approved during the war years alone. His equipment proved critical for military engineers constructing infrastructure supporting mechanized modern warfare. Wartime technological breakthroughs would shape post-war industry and society for decades to come. Synthetic rubber production, developed urgently after Japan seized natural rubber sources in Southeast Asia, became standard for automobile tires and countless other uses. Radar technology, perfected by the British and enhanced through American mass manufacturing, transformed aviation safety and weather prediction. Improvements in metallurgy, chemistry, and production methods created for military purposes found their way into civilian applications. The proximity fuse, engineered to make anti-aircraft artillery more effective by detonating shells near targets instead of demanding direct hits, later found applications in industrial automation and control mechanisms. Perhaps most significant for the long term was the impact on management and organizational systems. Orchestrating massive industrial enterprises, connecting intricate supply chains, and maintaining standards across thousands of factories taught principles that influenced American business for generations. The methods perfected at Willow Run and the Detroit Arsenal became textbook examples in business schools everywhere. Production management, inventory systems, quality control, and worker training techniques developed during wartime shaped manufacturing practices across all industries afterward. The sheer scale and complexity forced organizational innovations that likely would have taken decades to develop under peaceful conditions. The human consequences of industrial mobilization were deep and enduring. Millions of Americans gained new abilities, new self-assurance, and new ambitions through defense plant experience. Women who had mastered demanding industrial work found the idea of returning to purely household roles unsatisfying when peace came. Although many women did leave factories when returning servicemen needed jobs, the experience had revealed capabilities that couldn't be erased. The foundations of the women's movement emerging during the 1960s and 70s were partly rooted in wartime factories where women had demonstrated they could master any assignment with appropriate training and opportunity. For African American workers, wartime proved equally transformative. The Fair Employment Practices Committee, created through Presidential Executive Order in 1941, prohibited employment discrimination in defense industries. Although enforcement remained inconsistent, and discrimination continued, the principle had been established. Black workers gained entry into skilled positions, higher compensation, and union participation previously closed to them. Experiencing discrimination while contributing to defeating fascism abroad intensified calls for equality at home. Returning veterans who had fought tyranny internationally grew less willing to tolerate racism domestically. The civil rights movement that would reshape America during the 1950s and 60s drew much of its momentum from wartime experiences, demonstrating what happened when all citizens could participate fully. Economic change was equally profound. An economy wrestling with chronic joblessness throughout the 1930s reached full employment by 1943. Between 1940 and 1944, total industrial output doubled. This represented the most dramatic economic expansion America had experienced. Gross domestic product expanded from roughly $100 billion in 1940 to over $200 billion by 1945. War production drove nearly all this growth, yet it demonstrated productive potential that would support prosperity after hostilities ceased. Facilities constructed during wartime, power generation plants, factories, and transportation infrastructure continued delivering economic benefits for subsequent decades. Transitioning from military to civilian production after victory proved less problematic than many anticipated. Starting as early as 1944, planners began preparing for the shift from wartime to peacetime economy. The War Production Board confronted tough choices about when to release industries from military contracts. Release them too soon, military supplies could falter. Delay too long, the peacetime economy might collapse. The juggling act was delicate, but ultimately succeeded. Tank manufacturing ended abruptly when Germany fell in May 1945. Aircraft production continued until Japan's surrender in August, then ceased immediately. Cancelling war contracts created temporary joblessness as defense workers lost employment, yet conversion back to civilian manufacturing proceeded swiftly. Plants that had produced tanks returned to automobile manufacturing. The pent demand for consumer goods, suppressed during years of rationing and shortages, sparked rapid renewal. Americans who had accumulated savings during wartime because little was available to purchase suddenly possessed spending capacity. The automobile industry, having manufactured virtually nothing for civilians since early 1942, encountered explosive demand. Residential construction, minimal during war years, exploded as returning servicemen married and established households. The GI Bill gave veterans access to higher education and home financing, spurring economic expansion. America's industrial supremacy shaped the post-war international landscape. The Marshall Plan rebuilding Western Europe became feasible only because America possessed productive capacity, satisfying both domestic requirements and devastated allies' needs. American factories manufactured the machinery, trucks, and equipment Western European nations required to restore their economies. Cold War competition with the Soviet Union was sustained by American industrial capacity, enabling simultaneous consumer prosperity and military strength. The abundance characterizing the 1950s and 60s rested on industrial capabilities built during wartime. Echoes of World War II's industrial mobilization persist today. It demonstrated that democratic systems, when confronting existential danger, could organize resources and mobilize efforts matching or surpassing totalitarian regimes' scale. Production triumphs proved free people, contributing voluntarily for shared purposes, could outproduce forced labor. The industrial power securing victory furnished the foundation for enduring prosperity and worldwide influence. Democracy's arsenal had accomplished its mission through citizens' inventiveness and industry's productive strength. American industrial accomplishment becomes evident examining production statistics across categories. Beyond approximately 300,000 aircraft built during wartime, American factories delivered 86,000 tanks to armored forces. These equipped not only American forces, but British, French, and other Allied armies through Lend-Lease transfers. The Sherman tank, despite shortcomings facing German Tigers and Panthers, offered reliability and maintainability in combat conditions. Its genuine strength was volume. For every German heavy tank, dozens of Shermans existed. When one Sherman fell, 3 replacements stood ready. German tankers might prevail in individual battles, yet they could not overcome the mathematics of American production. Artillery output totaled 193,000 pieces. Designs ranged from small pack howitzers that mules could carry disassembled to massive railway guns capable of striking targets miles behind enemy positions. American artillery emphasized concentrated firepower. Forward observers could summon devastating fire concentrations onto German positions within minutes. This capability required sufficient artillery pieces and virtually unlimited ammunition. American factories supplied both abundantly. Ammunition manufacturing alone staggered the imagination. Billions of artillery shells, mortar rounds, and rifle ammunition were produced throughout the war years. Ammunition ships crossed Atlantic convoys, supplying the enormous expenditures American operational methods demanded. 2 million Army trucks furnished mobility revolutionizing military operations. Earlier armies depended heavily on railroads for logistics. Combat units could advance past railheads, but maintaining distant operations from rail networks proved challenging. American forces in Europe and the Pacific achieved unprecedented mobility because truck convoys could extend supply lines across hundreds of territory miles. The legendary Red Ball Express, which supplied the advance across France during summer 1944, required 33,000 soldiers driving 6,000 trucks on dedicated highways. Operating at peak efficiency, the Red Ball Express delivered 12,000 tons of supplies daily to forward-deployed combat troops. Only American factory output of seemingly excessive truck quantities made this logistical miracle possible until needs actually materialized. Small arms manufacturing matched heavier equipment scale. American factories produced millions of M1 Garand rifles, M1 carbines, Thompson submachine guns, and Browning automatic rifles. These weapons equipped American forces and supplied Allied armies whose production fell short. The M1 Garand, adopted shortly before the war, gave American infantry decisive advantages. It represented the only semi-automatic rifle standard issue to infantry during the entire conflict. German, British, Japanese, and Soviet infantrymen still carried bolt-action rifles requiring manual action between rounds. The Garand's 8-round clip and semi-automatic capability delivered superior firepower. General George Patton declared it the finest battle instrument ever created. Yet technical excellence mattered only because American factories manufactured Garands in quantities equipping every soldier. Industrial mobilization transcended purely military production. The nation's merchant marine grew dramatically to transport military cargo and maintain international commerce. Beyond approximately 2,010 Liberty ships, American yards built specialized variants, including 512 faster Victory ships, capable of 15 knots compared to Liberty cruising speeds of 11. Oil tankers transported petroleum from American and Caribbean reserves to European and Pacific theaters. Without sufficient tanker capacity, mechanized Allied forces would have stalled from fuel shortages. Standardized T2 tankers, manufactured like Liberty ships in substantial quantities, carried fuel. Refrigerated cargo ships transported perishables. Troop transports carried soldiers, hospital ships evacuated casualties. Each specialized vessel type required unique designs and equipment, yet all were manufactured in sufficient quantities satisfying expanding demands. Aircraft production totaling nearly 300,000 planes encompassed extraordinary diversity. Heavy bombers, including the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator, conducted strategic bombing campaigns against Germany and Japan. Medium bombers like the B-25 Mitchell and A-20 Havoc supported ground operations and attacked tactical objectives. Fighter aircraft, including the P-38 Lightning, P-47 Thunderbolt, and P-51 Mustang, delivered air superiority and ground strike capabilities. Naval aircraft flew from rapidly expanding aircraft carrier fleets. Transport aircraft like the C-47 Skytrain dropped paratroopers and resupplied isolated units. Training aircraft taught hundreds of thousands of pilots combat skills. Each aircraft model required different tooling, different parts, different production methods. Yet the industry produced all variants simultaneously, continuously improving designs based on battlefield experience. Supplying raw materials to this industrial colossus presented enormous difficulty. Steel production expanded, meeting military demands while maintaining essential civilian needs. Aluminum output increased dramatically, supplying aircraft builders. Copper scarcity became so extreme that the government borrowed silver from the treasury to wind electromagnetic coils for uranium enrichment at Oak Ridge. Japan's conquest of Southeast Asia eliminated rubber supplies. A frantic synthetic rubber program succeeded, just barely preventing critical shortages. By 1944, synthetic rubber production exceeded pre-war natural rubber imports. This alone demonstrated American industrial flexibility and technical ingenuity under pressure. Unexpected sources furnished the workforce, enabling this manufacturing accomplishment. Beyond women and minorities entering industrial employment, the labor force included teenagers abandoning school for defense plant work. Older workers came back to factory floors, contributing accumulated knowledge and experience. Individuals with disabilities found positions requiring no physical capability. The nation mobilized every accessible worker because meeting production targets demanded maximum effort. Educational programs taught industrial skills to factory newcomers. Secondary students learned machine operation. Housewives learned welding. Farmers and factory workers alike learned the skills of aircraft assembly. These programs worked because they had to work. The nation's victory hinged on one simple equation. Production meant survival, and survival meant having enough trained hands to keep the machines running. The labor itself was grueling and frequently perilous. Factories hummed with activity 24 hours a day, every single day, divided into 3 relentless shifts. Workers stood beside heavy machinery, handled chemicals that could burn through skin, and endured temperatures that would make most people collapse within minutes. Thousands of workers died in industrial accidents during those war years. Men and women fell from scaffolding high above factory floors. Machinery grabbed limbs without mercy. Explosions tore through plants. Fires consumed entire sections of defense facilities across the country. The desperate push for faster production sometimes meant cutting corners on safety, a gamble that cost lives. Yet workers went back day after day, understanding the terrible calculus. Every day of delayed production meant more soldiers bleeding in foxholes overseas. Every missed quota meant more mothers receiving telegrams they prayed would never come. The workers in Detroit, in the shipyards, in factories everywhere, knew with absolute certainty that their labor directly determined whether their sons, husbands, and brothers would return home or not. This knowledge became their strength through exhausting shifts, dangerous conditions, and sacrifices that touched every part of their lives. The price tag for this mobilization was almost incomprehensible. Between 1941 and 1945, the federal government spent roughly $300 billion on the war effort. Put that in perspective, this amount exceeded everything the American government had spent in the entire history of the nations up to that point. By 1944 and 1945, defense spending alone topped $80 billion annually. That represented 4 out of every $10 flowing through the entire national economy, devoted exclusively to military purposes. The government raised this staggering sum through taxes, war bonds, and borrowing. Tax rates climbed dramatically. The income tax, which had mainly affected wealthy Americans before the war, suddenly applied to most working people. New payroll systems were created to pull taxes directly from paychecks. Across the country, war bond drives rallied citizens to purchase bonds, essentially loaning money to the government that would be paid back with interest when peace returned. Despite the enormous government spending and heavy taxation, something remarkable happened. Inflation stayed under control. The Office of Price Administration set maximum prices on nearly everything. Rationing made sure scarce goods were distributed fairly to everyone, not just to those with the deepest pockets. This careful management prevented the runaway inflation that should have accompanied full employment and massive government borrowing. The result was unusual. Workers earned solid wages in defense plants but found little to actually spend their money on. Consumer goods sat behind government restrictions. Food and gasoline came with ration stamps. So Americans did something extraordinary. They saved. Vast quantities of money accumulated during the war years because there simply wasn't anything to buy. When the war ended and rationing lifted, these accumulated savings transformed into purchasing power that ignited post-war prosperity. The industrial mobilization opened doors for both ambitious entrepreneurs and established companies. Henry Kaiser, a construction engineer before the conflict, built the ships that carried the war effort and became wealthy in the process. Howard Hughes seized the moment to expand his aircraft operations dramatically, though his most ambitious creation, the towering H-4 Hercules flying boat, wouldn't actually take flight until after the fighting had stopped. Smaller manufacturers discovered profitable opportunities supplying parts to the major contractors. Machine shops that had employed a handful of workers transformed into substantial factories with hundreds of employees. The economic expansion generated wealth that would fuel growth for decades to come. When peace finally arrived, it brought wrenching transitions. Women who had worked in defense plants faced pressure to surrender their jobs to returning veterans. Many resented being pushed out of work they had mastered and found deeply satisfying. The experience of earning real wages and demonstrating genuine skill had transformed them in ways that couldn't be erased. Post-war society expected them to cheerfully abandon their hard-won roles and return to purely domestic lives. But that expectation collided with the reality of what these women had become. African-American workers discovered that wartime opportunity suddenly evaporated. Good jobs in defense industries disappeared as discriminatory practices returned with a vengeance. The employment and income gains that minorities had achieved during wartime proved temporary. These disappointments would fuel the social movements of coming decades demanding justice and equal treatment. Yet the reconversion to civilian production proceeded more smoothly than many had feared. Automobiles returned to assembly lines with impressive speed. By 1946, new cars were rolling off production lines, though demand far outpaced supply for years. Construction boomed as veterans married, started families, and dreamed of homes of their own. The GI Bill opened college doors and made low-cost home mortgages available. This policy transformed the middle class, expanding it into a genuine majority. Suburbs exploded across the landscape as young families pursued the dream of single-family homes with yards. Shopping centers emerged, drive-in restaurants became gathering places. Car-centered life became the American normal. The prosperity that defined the 1950s grew directly from wartime industrial expansion and post-war policies that channeled wartime savings into productive investment. American industrial dominance now shaped the entire global order. The United States had emerged from the war as the world's unchallenged economic powerhouse. The dollar itself became the currency that backed all other currencies worldwide. American companies expanded across the globe. Products stamped "Made in America" found eager buyers everywhere. In 1947, the Marshall Plan announced that America would spend billions rebuilding the economies of Western Europe. This generous commitment served American interests perfectly by creating prosperous nations that could trade with America and stand against Soviet expansion. But it was only possible because American factories could produce abundantly for both American consumers and international needs. The Cold War that followed depended fundamentally on American productive capacity. The massive military machine that remained after 1945, far larger than any peacetime force in American history, required industrial support that seemed limitless. Soviet leaders faced a sobering reality. They could never match American industrial depth across all areas. Their strategy emphasized conventional forces and nuclear weapons because their factories simply couldn't compete with American production across the board. Throughout the Cold War, American advantages rested on industrial foundations poured during the mobilization years. The wartime experience taught crucial lessons that shaped American government and business for generations. Large-scale coordination between Washington and private industry could accomplish what markets alone could not. Program management, systems engineering, and coordinated technical efforts born from wartime necessity became distinctly American capabilities. Techniques developed for building bombers and ships would be applied to the interstate highway system, the space program, and advanced weapon systems. The technological breakthroughs achieved during mobilization rippled far beyond battlefields. The proximity fuse represented a miniaturized electronics marvel. Traditional anti-aircraft shells needed direct hits or required operators to set them for specific altitudes. The proximity fuse carried a tiny radio transmitter and receiver inside the shell itself. When it passed near an aircraft, the reflected radio signal triggered detonation instantly. This dramatically improved anti-aircraft effectiveness. The fuse was so secret that initially it was used only over water to prevent its recovery by the enemy. Later, proximity-fused shells devastated German forces during the Battle of the Bulge. After the war, the miniaturized electronics technology found its way into industrial controls, automation systems, and eventually into more sophisticated electronic devices. Radar technology, invented by the British before the war, reached its full potential through American industrial methods. Early radar systems were enormous, finicky, and difficult to produce. American engineers redesigned them for mass production while actually improving both performance and reliability. Radar systems equipped ships, aircraft, and ground installations worldwide. They enabled operations in darkness and bad weather that would have been impossible using only the eyes. They detected approaching enemy planes and vessels. They guided interceptors to targets. After the war ended, radar revolutionized aviation by making all-weather operations routine. Weather radar let pilots see and avoid dangerous storms. Air traffic control radar made modern commercial aviation possible by letting controllers track dozens of aircraft simultaneously. Marine radar improved navigation and cut collisions dramatically. Technology developed to find enemies became essential for peacetime transportation and commerce. Military demands drove advances in metallurgy that benefited peacetime industries immensely. Aircraft production required aluminum alloys stronger and lighter than anything available before the war. Engines operating at extreme temperatures demanded specially designed high-temperature alloys. Armor plate needed steel alloys with characteristics entirely different from structural steels. The research efforts that produced these military materials elevated the entire field of metallurgy. Post-war industries inherited materials science knowledge developed under wartime pressure and urgency. The aluminum industry exploded during the war and remained a major economic force afterward. Aluminum found expanding uses in construction, transportation, and consumer products as improved production processes lowered costs. Chemical industries expanded enormously to meet military demands. Explosives production consumed massive quantities of nitrates and specialized chemicals. Poison gas production, despite the gases never actually being deployed in combat, required enormous chemical facilities. When natural rubber supplies were cut off, synthetic rubber production became essential and eventually became permanent. DDT and other pesticides developed for military purposes, protecting soldiers from disease-carrying insects, became valuable agricultural tools after peace returned. Penicillin production, scaled up urgently to treat wounded soldiers, became the foundation for the entire modern pharmaceutical industry. The wartime acceleration of medication development and mass production saved countless lives in the decades of peace that followed. The mass production techniques applied to military equipment fundamentally changed American manufacturing forever. The moving assembly line had been pioneered by Ford for automobiles before World War I. During the war years, these techniques were refined and extended to products vastly more complex than automobiles. Building bombers, tanks, and ships taught lessons that influenced manufacturing across every industry afterward. Just-in-time inventory systems, quality control methods, and production scheduling techniques, all developed during wartime, became standard business practices everywhere. The efficiency gains achieved under wartime pressure remained embedded in peacetime operations, contributing to American manufacturing leadership in the following decades. Training methods developed to teach industrial skills rapidly during the war permanently influenced education and workforce development. Before the war, skilled trades meant lengthy apprenticeships under experienced workers. Wartime production urgency demanded faster results. Technical schools developed intensive courses that taught specific skills quickly. Training within industry programs brought education directly to factory floors. Visual aids, hands-on practice, and structured curricula replaced the informal mentoring that had always characterized traditional apprenticeships. These innovations proved remarkably effective and continued after the war. Community colleges and vocational schools adopted the methods. The GI Bill, which sent millions of veterans to college, created demand for expanded educational capacity. Universities grew dramatically to handle the influx of veteran students, permanently enlarging American higher education. Wartime coordination of vast enterprises influenced management theory and practice profoundly. Before the war, most American businesses operated on a relatively small scale. Even large corporations functioned with minimal formal planning and coordination. Military production requirements forced development of sophisticated management techniques. Critical path analysis, program management, systems engineering, and other methods were developed or refined during those years. Harvard Business School and other institutions studied wartime management practices and incorporated the lessons into their teaching. The generation of managers who honed their skills during the mobilization carried those lessons into peacetime industries, shaping American business culture for decades to come. The social impacts were just as profound. The experience of women working in defense plants challenged traditional gender roles in ways that couldn't be undone. While many women left industrial work after the war, they had proven capabilities that society couldn't forget. The cultural symbol of Rosie the Riveter, though partly propaganda, represented real achievements by real women. Post-war society couldn't fully return to pre-war gender expectations after women had demonstrated genuine skill in demanding industrial jobs. The women's movement that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s drew partly on memories and lessons from those wartime experiences. For African Americans, the wartime industrial experience proved equally transformative. The Great Migration, which had moved black workers from the rural South to northern cities during and after World War I, accelerated dramatically during the 1940s. Defense industries in Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles, and other cities offered wages that vastly exceeded anything black workers could earn in the segregated South. Discrimination persisted in northern cities, but opportunities existed that were simply unavailable back home. The experience of contributing to the war effort while still facing discrimination sharpened demands for civil rights. Black veterans returning from fighting fascism abroad proved unwilling to tolerate racial oppression at home. The civil rights movement that transformed America in the 1950s and 60s drew inspiration and energy partly from wartime experiences. The post-war prosperity, beginning in the late 1940s and extending through the 1960s, rested substantially on foundations laid during the mobilization. The industrial capacity created during the war kept producing in peacetime. The infrastructure investments, power plants, transportation networks, factory buildings, remained productive assets. The skilled workforce developed through wartime training programs continued working. The management expertise developed coordinating vast enterprises applied to peacetime businesses. The technological advances created for military purposes found civilian applications. The accumulated wartime savings of workers provided capital for investment. All these elements combined to create the most extended period of broadly shared prosperity in American history. The international order that emerged after the war reflected American industrial dominance. The Bretton Woods system established the dollar as the world's reserve currency, backed ultimately by American productive capacity. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank, headquartered in Washington, managed international finance and development. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Europe using American resources and know-how. NATO provided security guarantees backed by American military power, which itself rested on continued American industrial capacity. Japan's post-war transformation into an economic power occurred under American occupation, guided by American advisors who applied lessons learned from their own mobilization experience. The global economic system that dominated for decades rested fundamentally on American industrial and financial dominance. The Cold War tested American industrial capacity in new ways. The massive military establishment maintained after the war, far exceeding any peacetime force in American history, required sustained industrial support. Aircraft production, while far below wartime peaks, continued at substantial levels. Shipbuilding persisted, particularly aircraft carriers and submarines, for the expanding Navy. The Korean War in the early 1950s required renewed mobilization, though smaller in scale than the World War II effort. The space race beginning in the late 1950s demanded industrial and technical capabilities that drew directly from wartime experiences. The Apollo program that landed men on the Moon in 1969 employed systems engineering and program management techniques developed during the war years. The eventual American victory in the Cold War, achieved without direct military conflict between the superpowers, reflected industrial and economic advantages rooted in wartime mobilization. The Soviet Union, despite possessing massive military forces and nuclear weapons, could never match American productive capacity across all categories. Soviet citizens endured persistent shortages and limited consumer goods, while American affluence kept expanding. The contrast between Western prosperity and Eastern deprivation ultimately eroded Soviet legitimacy. When the Soviet system finally collapsed between 1989 and 1991, the outcome reflected economic competition the Soviets had lost decades before. The World War II industrial mobilization continues shaping America and the world today. It demonstrated that free societies, when threatened, could organize and mobilize as effectively as totalitarian regimes. It proved that democratic governance and market economies were compatible with, indeed supportive of, large-scale coordinated efforts. It showed that diversity could be strength rather than weakness, as women and minorities contributed decisively to production. It revealed unsuspected capacities in ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary achievements when necessity demanded. These lessons remained relevant long after peace returned, influencing American responses to subsequent challenges and shaping national identity. The factories have largely disappeared or been repurposed. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant stopped producing tanks after the Korean War and eventually closed. Parts of the massive facility still stand, remnants of a different era, though tanks no longer roll from assembly lines there. Willow Run produced automobiles after the war, then manufactured parts for other industries, and was finally demolished despite preservation efforts to recognize its historic significance. The shipyards that launched Liberty ships by the thousands closed as post-war merchant shipping demand declined. The physical evidence of the mobilization has largely vanished. Yet the achievement endures in statistics that still astonish and in historical memory recognizing what was accomplished. The final accounting reveals extraordinary magnitude. American factories produced approximately 295,959 military aircraft during the war years. This represented growth from fewer than 3,000 planes in 1939 to peak production exceeding 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. Roosevelt's initially seemingly impossible goal of 50,000 planes in 12 months became not just achieved, but exceeded by a staggering margin. This transformation demonstrates what coordinated national effort could accomplish. The sleeping giant had truly awakened, and its industrial strength proved decisive in determining the war's outcome.